Welcome to Biden Brief. The content of the briefing includes gag order against Trump in January 6 case put on hold by appellate court. With two wars raging, can the U.S. afford to take on China? Biden pitches infrastructure plan for Latin America as debt trap alternative. Blinken urges pauses in fighting to deliver aid for Gaza civilians. U.S. Congress urged to approve Pacific Island pacts to counter Chinese influence. Gag order against Trump in January 6 case put on hold by appellate court. Washington Post. A federal appeals court has temporarily lifted a gag order on former President Donald Trump in his federal election obstruction case in D.C. Trump had argued that the restrictions violated his First Amendment rights. The court will now consider his claim, with briefs from both sides due over the next 3 weeks. Trump's attorneys argued that the limitations on his speech were too vague, and that there was no evidence that his posts had led to harassment or intimidation. The gag order had been imposed by Judge Tanya S. Chutkan, who expressed concern about potential threats to individuals singled out by Trump on social media. With two wars raging, can the U.S. afford to take on China? South China Morning Post. U.S. President Joe Biden has declared that the U.S. defense agreement with the Philippines is ironclad, amid rising tensions in the South China Sea. His comments followed collisions between Philippine and Chinese vessels near the Second Thomas Shoal. However, the article suggests that the U.S. is facing the real prospect of imperial overstretch, as it becomes increasingly involved in conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, leaving its strategic position in the Asia-Pacific region vulnerable. The article argues that the U.S. needs to present a credible alternative to China's mega development initiative in Asia, and address concerns of strategic abandonment among its Asian allies. Biden pitches infrastructure plan for Latin America as debt trap alternative. South China Morning Post. U.S. President Joe Biden has announced a new investment program to provide Latin American and Caribbean nations with an alternative to China's debt trap deals in the region. The U.S. will channel billions of dollars through the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation and the Inter-American Development Bank to build sustainable infrastructure and strengthen supply chains. Biden's announcement came at the First America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity Summit in Washington, where Western Hemisphere leaders and officials discussed economic ties and migration issues. China's Belt and Road Initiative has expanded its influence in the region through infrastructure deals and trade ties. Blinken urges pauses in fighting to deliver aid for Gaza civilians. New York Times. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has called for humanitarian pauses in the fighting between Israel and Hamas, and urged the protection of Palestinian non-combatants. He has also spoken of solidarity with Israel's right to defend itself. However, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has apparently rebuffed the Biden administration's call for pauses in the military campaign. He has said that any ceasefire would be contingent on the release of Israeli hostages, many of them women and children, abducted in the attack by Hamas on October 7. The Israeli military said on Thursday that its troops had encircled Gaza City and were engaged in face-to-face battles with Hamas. U.S. Congress urged to approve Pacific Island pacts to counter Chinese influence. South China Morning Post. U.S. House representatives from Guam and Hawaii are urging Congress to pass legislation implementing strategic pacts with Pacific Island nations and countering Chinese aggression towards the Philippines. The agreements, known as the Compacts of Free Association (COFA), grant the U.S. military access to the land, air, and sea of the three countries in exchange for economic aid and migration rights. The pacts began in the 1980s, but have become part of the U.S. government's strategy to counter China's influence in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. is also being urged to bolster its diplomatic presence in the region and conduct joint patrols with the Philippines in the South China Sea. Trudeau in Washington to discuss economic trade and humanitarian pause in Israel. The Globe and Mail. Over 400 Canadians and their family members in the Gaza Strip will be allowed to leave, according to a message from the Canadian government. The departures will not start until Sunday at the earliest, and Canadians will be given specific dates on which to cross at Rafah into Egypt. However, the note warned that the situation at the Rafah crossing remains unpredictable, and that Canada does not determine who is permitted to enter Egypt. So far, only one Canadian has been able to leave Gaza since Hamas's attacks on Israel in October. Jill Biden reveals initial thoughts when she first met Joe Biden. The Independent. First Lady Dr. Jill Biden has poked fun at President Joe Biden's style when they first met in 1975. Speaking at a fundraiser, she said, "I took one look at his perfect suit and his leather loafers and I thought, thank God it's only one date." Well, one date eventually turned into a marriage proposal. At the time, Jill Biden was hesitant to fall in love again, having previously been married to Bill Stevenson from 1970 to 1975. Maine mass shooter was alive for most of massive two-day search, autopsy suggests. The Globe and Mail. Robert Card, who opened fire at a bowling alley and a bar in Lewiston, Maine, before going on the run, was alive and possibly on the move for over 24 hours after the shootings, according to the Maine Medical Examiner's Office. Card eventually died from a self-inflicted gunshot. The police came under scrutiny for not finding Card's body earlier, but the medical examiner's office said that Card's heart emptied of blood after the gunshot wound, affecting the way the blood settled in his body and making the time of death less certain. Republican state AGs urge court to strike down Biden rule on tipped worker pay. Reuters. A group of 11 Republican attorneys general have filed a brief urging the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals to reject a 2021 Department of Labor (DOL) rule aimed at raising the minimum wage for tipped workers. The rule requires workers to be paid the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour, rather than the tipped minimum wage of $2.13, for non-tipped tasks that take up more than 20% of their time, or 30 consecutive minutes. The attorneys general argue that the rule infringes on states' rights to regulate labor standards and would restrict their ability to set minimum wages. Speaker Johnson led House passage of Israel aid. But the hard part comes next in confronting Biden. Associated Press. New Speaker Mike Johnson has shown that he is more than willing to lift up the priorities of the far-right House Republican majority rather than compromise. Johnson sought to force the Israel-Hamas war package to be paid for with government spending cuts, turning what is normally a bipartisan issue into a divisive one. It is an example of what might come, with the looming government shutdown deadline, President Joe Biden's request for aid to Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan and U.S. border security policy, and the presidential impeachment inquiry all demanding attention from Johnson. The Speaker is trying to unite the fractured House Republican majority, and has positioned himself as someone who can unite the GOP's flanks. Johnson is closely aligned with Donald Trump, the Republican frontrunner in the 2024 election, and has positioned himself as a Trump defender who challenged the 2020 election results. He has also aligned himself with the deeply conservative and growing Christian nationalist wing of the GOP. Biden in Maine to meet families after mass shooting. BBC. U.S. President Joe Biden has visited Maine to meet with families and first responders following a mass shooting that left 18 dead. The attack, which took place at a bowling alley and bar in the town of Lewiston on October 25, was the deadliest shooting in Maine's history. Another 13 people were injured in the incident. Biden has reiterated his calls for a ban on assault weapons and tougher gun control in the wake of the shooting. The perpetrator, Robert Card, was found dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound days after the attack. Why 6% commissions on U.S. home sales are on trial. Bloomberg. The U.S. Justice Department is investigating how real estate agents are paid, while class action lawsuits are accusing the National Association of Realtors, NAR, and several large residential brokerages of colluding to keep commissions high. A Missouri jury recently found in favor of the plaintiffs in one lawsuit, potentially resulting in multi-billion-dollar damages. The jury found that the NAR and others colluded to keep commissions high. Commissions in the U.S. are significantly higher than in other countries, and critics argue that industry collusion prevents price competition. The Justice Department is examining whether the commissions system violates antitrust law. U.S. faces tricky questions with African trade group. New York Times. The U.S. government has suspended 4 African nations from a trade program aimed at promoting economic development in Africa, over their human rights records. The African Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA, which was signed into law in 2000, is open to sub-Saharan African nations and allows them to export certain goods to the U.S. without having to pay duties. Uganda is one of the countries suspended due to its recent anti-gay legislation. Uganda's trade advisor to the president, Susan Mwizi, argued that Uganda is an island of peace, and said removing it from the program would damage the livelihoods of traders. The move highlights the tension between promoting democracy and human rights and maintaining influence abroad. The Biden administration has stressed the importance of engaging African nations as equals, but risks appearing to lecture or impose its values on countries that have a painful history of colonial rule. Critics of the suspension argue that it could end up punishing ordinary people for the actions of their governments and push African nations towards rival countries. Appeals courts temporarily lifts Trump's gag order as he fights the restrictions on his speech. The Toronto Star. A U.S. federal appeals court has temporarily lifted a gag order on Donald Trump in his 2020 election interference case in Washington. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit decision puts a hold on the limited gag order to give the judges time to consider Trump's request for a longer pause on the restrictions while his appeals play out. The appeals court said the temporary pause should not be construed in any way as a ruling on the merits of Trump's bid. It's the most serious restriction a court has put on the speech of the GOP presidential primary frontrunner and criminal defendant in four separate cases. Trump-appointed official sentenced to nearly 6 years over January 6 riot. The Independent. Federico Klein, a former State Department official in the Trump administration, has been sentenced to nearly 6 years in prison for his role in the January 6 Capitol riot. Klein, a Marine Corps veteran, was found guilty of repeatedly assaulting police officers and encouraging other rioters to join the violence. Prosecutors argued that Klein's participation in the riot was motivated by a desire to keep his job as a presidential appointee. Klein's defense attorney accused prosecutors of exaggerating his role due to his political connection to the Trump administration. He will also have to pay a fine and restitution. Democratic mayors plead for help in Washington as migrant crisis deepens. Yahoo! Democratic mayors of cities grappling with an influx of migrants are seeking assistance from the federal government. Mayors Mike Johnston of Denver and Brandon Johnson of Chicago met with White House officials on Thursday to plead for more help with their own cities' growing migrant populations. New York Mayor Eric Adams, who was also supposed to attend, hurried home after his top campaign fundraiser was raided by the FBI. The meeting followed a letter written by Johnston and co-signed by Adams and Johnson, as well as Mayors Karen Bass of Los Angeles and Sylvester Turner of Houston, which pleaded for more help from the federal government. The Biden administration is asking Congress for another $1.4 billion to handle the migrant crisis. The mayors who came to Washington this week are asking him for $5 billion. U.S. airs concerns to China about dangerous and unlawful South China Sea actions. Yahoo! The United States and China have held candid talks on maritime issues, including the South China Sea, with the U.S. side expressing its concerns about dangerous and unlawful Chinese actions. The meeting between the U.S. State Department's China Coordinator, Mark Lambert, and China's Director General for Boundary and Ocean Affairs, Hong Liang, was described as substantive, constructive, and candid and covered a range of maritime issues. The U.S. underscored its concerns with China's actions in the South China Sea, including the obstruction of a Philippine resupply mission and the unsafe intercept of a U.S. aircraft. The meeting follows recent high-level diplomacy ahead of an expected meeting between U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the APEC summit in San Francisco. Ex-Trump lawyer Eastman faces potential disbarment as ethics trial winds down. Reuters. A California judge has issued a preliminary finding of culpability against John Eastman, former President Donald Trump's personal lawyer, in a disciplinary trial regarding his actions during the 2020 U.S. presidential election. Eastman is accused of violating attorney ethics rules by attempting to help Trump overturn Joe Biden's win. The preliminary ruling allows state bar prosecutors to present evidence to support disbarment. Eastman's unproven claims of voter fraud allegedly led to harassment of election officials and undermined public trust in election results. The trial is set to conclude on Friday, and both sides will file closing arguments before the judge issues her ruling, which is appealable. Eastman has separately been indicted on criminal charges in Georgia for his role in trying to overturn the election there. Former Fox host Tucker Carlson sees Julian Assange at Belmarsh Prison. The Independent. Tucker Carlson, former anchor for Fox News, visited Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, in London's Belmarsh Prison. The reason for the visit was not disclosed, but it could potentially be related to a future guest appearance on Carlson's show. Assange is currently facing extradition to the U.S. on charges of violating the Espionage Act. He has been in prison since 2019 and has been challenging his extradition status. In June, a London court denied his most recent appeal. If convicted in the U.S., Assange could face a sentence of over 100 years in prison. Recently, U.S. Congressman Thomas Massie and James McGovern called on the Biden administration to drop the prosecution against Assange. A group of Australian officials also visited Washington in September to seek support in stopping the extradition process. Hello, everyone. It's your resident observer from the 6 Degrees World, Dr. Six. I hope you're all ready for another round of news updates and analysis. Let's dive right in. First up, we have the news that a federal appeals court has temporarily lifted the gag order on former President Donald Trump in his federal election obstruction case. Trump argued that the restrictions violated his First Amendment rights, and now the court will consider his claim. It's interesting to see this case unfold, as it raises questions about the limits of free speech and the power of public figures on social media. Personally, I think it's important to strike a balance between protecting individuals from harassment and allowing for robust political discourse. Moving on, we have a thought-provoking article discussing whether the U.S. can afford to take on China while dealing with conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The South China Sea tensions and China's mega development initiative in Asia are putting the U.S. in a precarious position. It's clear that the U.S. needs to present a credible alternative to China's influence in the region and address concerns among its Asian allies. It'll be interesting to see how the U.S. navigates these challenges and balances its strategic interests. Next, President Joe Biden has announced an investment program to provide Latin American and Caribbean nations with an alternative to China's debt trap deals. The U.S. aims to build sustainable infrastructure and strengthen supply chains in the region. This move demonstrates Biden's efforts to counter China's influence and expand economic ties in the Western Hemisphere. It's a smart move to offer an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative, but it remains to be seen how effective it will be in practice. In the Middle East, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has called for humanitarian pauses in the fighting between Israel and Hamas, urging the protection of Palestinian non-combatants. However, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected the call for pauses in the military campaign. The situation in Gaza remains tense, and it's clear that finding a resolution will be challenging. The international community plays a crucial role in mediating the conflict and ensuring the protection of civilians on both sides. Shifting gears, U.S. House representatives are urging Congress to pass strategic pacts with Pacific Island nations to counter Chinese aggression. The compacts of free association grant the U.S. military access to land, air, and sea in exchange for economic aid and migration rights. These agreements are part of the U.S. government's strategy to counter China's influence in the Indo-Pacific region. It's crucial for the U.S. to bolster its diplomatic presence in the area and work closely with its allies to maintain stability and security. Lastly, let's talk about some lighter news. First Lady Dr. Jill Biden recently shared a humorous story about her initial thoughts when she first met President Joe Biden. It's always fun to get a glimpse into the personal lives of our political figures and see a lighter side of them. And speaking of lighter news, it seems that Tucker Carlson, former anchor for Fox News, paid a visit to Julian Assange in Belmarsh Prison. The reason for the visit is unknown, but it could potentially be related to a future guest appearance on Carlson's show. The case of Julian Assange is a complex one, and it continues to generate debate and controversy. And there you have it, folks. Another round of news updates and analysis from the 6 Degrees world. I hope you enjoyed it. Now it's time for your thoughts and questions. What do you make of these news stories? Do you have any burning questions for me? Let's keep the discussion going. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.